So go ahead and record. Yep. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ruth Heronshaw, and I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Manatee County. On behalf of the League, I welcome you to our Hot Topics presentation, which is storm surge, flooding, and wildfires. Are we ready? Today's program is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. Any use of the recording other than showing in its entirety must get written permission from the League. At the end of the presentations by our speaker, we will be taking questions. Please put your questions in chat for Randy Miller, who's the Natural Resources Action Team Chair. Randy has arranged today's presentation and will introduce our speakers. Randy, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. Presenting today are Nina Venter and Nick Chiavini of the Sarasota Manatee Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm just going to refer to as the MPO during my remarks here. We greatly appreciate their discussing with us today the Resilience and Vulnerability Assessment adopted by the MPO in September of 2024. As part of their presentation, they will offer some background about the MPO before moving into discussion of the assessment. Please put your questions in chat, as Ruth noted, where they'll be reviewed by a League member and then posed to Nina and Nick at the conclusion of their presentation. Nina Venter is a senior planner at the MPO, where she works on multimodal transportation planning, safety, and project prioritization. With a background in urban and community sociology, she brings a multidisciplinary perspective to active transportation and regional planning in support of long-range regional goals. Nick Chiavini is a transportation planner at the Sarasota Manatee Metropolitan Planning Organization, where he works on regional transportation planning, safety, and long-range decision-making. His background includes municipal planning and infrastructure-related work in both the public and private sectors, supporting a broad range of transportation and planning efforts. So with that, Nina and Nick, it's all yours. I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, Nina Venter, Senior Planner with the MPO. Thank you so much for having us join and present to you today on our Resiliency and Vulnerability Assessment. So if you give me a moment here, I'm going to share my screen. So what we have here is the future of transportation resiliency in Manatee and Sarasota counties. Since
your screen isn't shared, Nina.
There we go.
There it is.
Okay, perfect. We are a two-county MPO, so we do take a more regional two-county approach. And our scope as an MPO is regional in nature. And I'll kind of give you a bigger idea of what that means in just a moment. So as a quick overview, we do want to explain what an MPO is. I think generally most folks don't know what a metropolitan planning organization or transportation planning organization is, and I surely did not when I took this job. And so I think it's very important to offer that background and context to understand what MPOs do, what our role is, and why it really matters to know what an MPO is and why we focus on resiliency and vulnerability. I'll give you a little bit of background on our MPO specifically, and then I'll hand it over to Nick at that point to dive into the resiliency and vulnerability assessment, and then we'll kind of talk about what our next steps are. So metropolitan planning organizations, MPOs, what are they? Also known as transportation planning organizations. MPOs are government organizations that were created by federal government in the 1960s. And the purpose of MPOs is to ensure that transportation planning happens at a regional scale instead of being siloed in each jurisdiction. So as we know, larger metropolitan areas don't conform to city or county boundaries. And when we look at regional travel needs and regional patterns and regional impacts, such as storm surge, they happen across jurisdictional lines. And so MPOs really exists to help coordinate the various jurisdictions within an urban area to look at transportation planning and needs at a more regional scale. So an MPO or a TPO as a government organization is really a regional partnership. And it's a partnership of the cities and the counties within the MPO's boundaries, including our transit agencies, and then also working closely with the state and the federal government as well. MPOs are required for any metropolitan area that has a population of 50,000 or more. So as soon as a region hits 50,000 people, it triggers the federal mandate to create a metropolitan planning organization. And the reason why that's important is because once it reaches that threshold, federal funding becomes available for that area for transportation planning and coordination. So when an MPO is established, it's able to pull down these transportation-specific funds from the federal government. And so the MPO's role really is then to coordinate with the jurisdictions within the boundary as well as the state to plan for transportation, identify projects that will meet the needs of the region, and then also to prioritize those projects by working with the local governments. Again, we're looking specifically at transportation projects. And then we have an MPO board that approves those projects for funding. We also look 25 years in the future. So we focus really on long-range planning. What MPOs do not do is we do not implement projects. So we help plan, we help prioritize, we help fund, and we coordinate. But as soon as projects are funded, that is usually handed over to the implementing agency, which is going to be the jurisdiction or the state. So when you reach out to the MPO for information about a specific construction project or a project in design, what we're going to do is try and figure out who is implementing that project and get you the information that you need. So we do not actually implement those projects. We are governed by a governing board of appointed local elected officials that represent every single one of the jurisdictions in our MPO boundary. And once again, the focus is regional transportation. So on the right here, what you see on your slide is our sort of network designation in the two-county area, with an emphasis here on Manatee County. And our focus as an MPO is on those interregional, regional connections. So major regional people movers that is going to get people through or across the region. But then when we look at a closer map, there's a great deal of local roads and local projects, and those are usually the jurisdiction of the city or the county. So our scope is regional in nature. So this MPO Sarasota Manatee was established in 1978. This was just a couple of years before we reached that 50,000 threshold. We are currently a 17-member governing board that represents both counties and the 9 municipalities within our region. We also have a board member who represents the Sarasota Manatee Airport Authority. Another port that we have in the region is Seaport Manatee, but that is overseen by Manatee County, and so they are represented by their appointed county commissions. And then FDOT District 1 is also represented on the MPO board as a non-voting advisory member. So any of the work that the MPO does, any of the policies that we have is approved and adopted by our MPO governing board. As an MPO, I think we have a very interesting planning context. So we are a coastal region, which certainly creates that mandate for focusing on resiliency and understanding what our vulnerabilities in our transportation system really is. So resiliency is really key. And in our MPO area, we have a total of 3 different watersheds. We've got the Water Bay watershed, the Tampa Bay tributaries, including Manatee River and the Braden River, and then the Sarasota Bay, Peace, and Myakka rivers as well. So for us as a planning mandate, focusing on resiliency and understanding our vulnerabilities is absolutely key. We also have a very interesting population dynamic and a lot of interesting movements throughout the region. But we also are on a very clear growth pattern, right? A very persistent regional growth. So the map that you see on the right side of your screen is the MPO's planning area, the 2 counties. And this sort of shows where our projected growth is over the next 25 years. So the areas that are darker in color is expected to see the greatest amount of growth over the next 25 years. So based on the population projections that we developed about 2 years ago, we're expecting to see at least 250,000 more people on the roads, for a total population of about 1.2 million people. So this is a lot of people to plan for, a lot of transportation that will be developed, and a lot more people that our existing transportation infrastructure needs to accommodate. So what we want to do is be sure that as we plan, we can accommodate this growth while also maintaining the security of our transportation system. So the long-range transportation plan is the foundation, the North Star of all of the work that the MPO does. It is a state and federal mandate, so every MPO will have one. It is a 25-year plan, so it is long-range in nature, and we update it every 5 years. The scale is regional, and our focus is multimodal. So while we're looking also at roadway capacity projects, we're also looking at things like sidewalks and bike lanes, trails, and recently taking on a more focused look on transit as well. We just adopted our plan in October, so this one will be in effect for the next 25 years. The plan is really intended to respond to changing values and priorities, and I'll get into that in just a moment. As you'll see how resiliency and vulnerability became more and more important in the planning work that the MPO has done. The goal also is the LRTP to align federal, state, and local goals and objectives, that those needs to be synchronous. And it also builds on previous planning data and analysis and identified needs. So the work that we do for the next 5 years will inform the update of the next long-range transportation plan. The work that we've done for the last 5 years has basically built the existing 2050 plan that we have in place now. Perhaps one of the most important parts of the long-range transportation plan is its financial analysis component. So as part of the long-range plan, we look at all of the various funding sources that are available to the region that could be used to fund transportation projects. And then we have to identify what our comprehensive transportation needs are, what are the projects that we want to see implemented in the region, and then realistically, how many of those projects can we fund over the next 25 years? And that's what we call the cost feasible plan. And the cost feasible plan is absolutely critical because the funding that is available through the MPO is limited to the projects that are identified in the cost feasible plan. So when you see more about the work that we did with the assessment, the outcome of that assessment was the resiliency component of our long-range transportation plan. We were able to identify key priority projects that we, based on the analysis, believe will improve the resiliency and reduce the vulnerability of our region, and build those into our long-range plan so that the local jurisdictions can apply for them and we can apply funding to getting those projects developed. Inevitably, everyone wants to know how much funding is actually available. So the table that you see here on your screen is our revenue forecasts over the next 25 years. So in total, with all the available funding, not including funds, local funds from your cities or your counties, is just under $2 billion. And this is specifically federal funding through the MPO, as well as funds that are coming through FDOT District 1. So $2 billion seems like a great deal of funds, but given the cost of transportation projects, we'll see that the need far outweighs the available funding. And so prioritizing projects becomes absolutely essential. You'll see in brackets there, I've got SU and transportation alternatives highlighted. Those are the 2 transportation funding sources that comes through the MPO specifically. So these are the funds that the MPO has direct discretion over. And and that the MPO must approve the use of those funding for transportation projects. So in total, it's just about $320 odd million over the 25 years. But we work very closely with the state to really capitalize our funds and or leverage our funds and the district's funds in order to move priority projects forward. You'll see that I have two funding sources crossed off. So the carbon reduction program was recently, what's the word? The state of Florida decided to not accept the federal funds and has basically returned that money to the federal government. And so we no longer have access to those funds to implement our projects. And so those values are not reflected in the totals in the bottom row. So I just wanted to point that one out. So our long-range plan, it has 8 goals and objectives. I'm not going to go through all of these, but really for the sake of resiliency and vulnerability, and as our North Star, we focus on safety and infrastructure to plan for efficient evacuations and safe returns back home following storms. But then also to identify and mitigate the effects of stormwater impacts on the system and other hazards. So the resiliency assessment does look at stormwater, but then also nuisance flooding and wildfires. So I point this out just to say that focusing on resiliency and vulnerability will be an ongoing mandate for the MPO and focus the work that we do moving forward. It is built into our long-range plan. So where these 4 goals and objectives came from are from these 4 sort of big picture scenarios. When we developed the plan, we really asked, what's important to the region and what do people want to see the MPO focus on over the next 25 years. High value economic growth, vibrant places, and environmental health were in the previous 2045 long range plan. But for the 2050 plan, creating resilient communities was added in. So this is a new sort of focus area for the MPO. And the reason why this is important was the 2045 really helped us get set up for focusing on resiliency and vulnerability. But this sort of demonstrates also how the LRTP is meant to accommodate and change to those changing values and priorities. There's a very clear focus on this region on managing stormwater, dealing with storm surge, and other natural hazards. So creating resilient communities was added in to the new 2050 long-range transportation plan. This is the vision map in the LRTP, and I'm going to ask you in this map to really focus on the blue highlighted corridors. That is the outcome of the resiliency and vulnerability assessment. So based on the analysis that we did, our understanding now is that these are high priority focus areas for our regional transportation assets to improve the resiliency in our region. So a great deal of the projects that we have identified in the long-range plan as eligible for our funds is based on this analysis and built into our long-range plan here. And you can see that there's other focus areas for us as well, but infrastructure and resiliency is there as well. So this is a kind of an overview of how we got to the resiliency and vulnerability assessment, and I'll turn it over to Nick after this. The 2045 LRTP was adopted in 2020, but in the years leading up to it, there was a clear conversation happening in the region and also statewide and nationwide that resiliency is important and that metropolitan areas need to focus on it. So in 2018, the MPO hosted an all hazards recovery workshop. And out of that workshop came the security assessment report. So something that the MPO put together based on what we heard at the workshop and in our relationships with our regional partners. That security assessment report basically said that the MPO and the region as a whole does really need to focus on understanding what our risks and our vulnerabilities are so that we can better prioritize our funding for key transportation assets, right? As we know, the needs far outweigh the available funds, and so we need to prioritize the right projects to make sure that they have the biggest impact. So that basically led to the 2045 LRTP laying the foundation for prioritizing resiliency planning. So out of the 2045 long-range plan, we identified the resiliency and vulnerability assessments as a planning study that we will be accomplishing. So out of that, we completed phase 1 and phase 2 of that assessment. So phase one really did a comprehensive analysis of the transportation system and identified our most vulnerable assets. And then in phase two, we refined that list to the most critical roadways and then updated our prioritization scoring accordingly as well. And what I mean by that is that when jurisdictions come to the MPO to apply for funding, we score every single project against a prioritization sort of framework. And so if a project for which they are applying for is identified in our resiliency assessment, then they get more points for that project. If the project does not fall on any of our resiliency corridors, then they don't get those points. And this is a way for us to really elevate resiliency as a prioritized factor as we evaluate all of the available projects. And then lastly is once we did that, all of that information, that analysis, that list of projects was then built into the 2050 long range plan. So local jurisdictions are now able to come to the MPO during our annual call for projects and apply for funding to improve resiliency on those corridors. So at the base of all of this, and really what motivates the work is the larger planning context, which is in the state and in the nation, right? So even before the 2045 LRTP really got into going, there were conversations at the national level about resiliency. In 2021, federal legislation was passed, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which created one of several discretionary grant programs, one of them being the Protect Grant Program. This program, it does not require that regions do resiliency planning, but it does greatly motivate or incentivize MPOs and cities and counties to do resiliency planning by making available funds for those projects. So if an MPO or a jurisdiction has a plan in place, they are then able to apply for funding through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for this Protect Grant Program. And then the federal government is able to do a match to lower the overall costs of those programs. So this was very important for incentivizing resiliency planning as well. And one of the reasons that the 2045 LRTP really emphasized resiliency, because we knew that there was going to be funding available. And by doing the assessment ourselves, it better lines up our local partners for applying for those funds. And then in the same year, Florida legislation was the Statewide Flooding and Sea Level Rise Act or legislation, and that established the Resilient Florida program, and that is administered through the Department of Environmental Protection, which also makes some funding available. And if there's a really great way to motivate planning work, is to make funds available to implement those programs. So I share that as a larger context for why this work was done, right? It's the same thing with safety as a topic. Safety is a priority at the national and the state level, but also there are funds available for implementing those projects. When we look at the future of planning and specific resiliency planning specifically, one big question we have is going to be around the reauthorization of this Infrastructure Act. Will that funding still be there? And if so, how does that change how we go about doing the resiliency planning? So all of that to say, we did this assessment. We certainly, as a coastal MPO, have about 145 miles exposed to a combination of flood hazards. So it's absolutely essential that we know where those are, improve them as we can. And then also there's funding available, right? And so that it incentivizes us to keep doing this work. As we started the assessment as well, we had a Hurricane Ian hit, and as we all know, that was a major and devastating storm to our region. We also saw that prioritizing transportation assets was absolutely essential. As we saw causeways flood away, a great deal of inland flooding, which then and in the subsequent storms was fairly new to the region as well. We saw flooding where we previously really hadn't before. And we also saw detour routes shut down, and noted that newer structures and housing survived. And so it became really important for us to also talk to our regional partners to understand what went right, what went wrong, and how can we better prepare. So at that point, I think I'll hand it over to Nick so we can get into the exciting assessment.
All right, thank you, Nina. All right, let me share my screen here. All right, is my screen sharing correctly here?
Perfect.
Perfect. All right, thank you. All right, well, yeah, thanks for having us today, and thank you, Nina, for giving us the important background as to why we underwent these resiliency and vulnerability assessments. Kind of touched on this that it's no surprise to anyone here that we're in a particularly vulnerable region. As Dina pointed out, there's 145 miles exposed to flooding, but we also have wildfires to worry about and nuisance flooding. And yeah, Dina kind of covered this slide. I'll go ahead. So this brings us to the resiliency and vulnerability assessment that touched on. And basically, its objectives were taking a regional approach and providing an understanding of the region's vulnerability and developing a prioritized list of assets that are at risk to extreme weather events and stresses. And ultimately, the goal is to us as an MPO and our local partners to make informed decisions about the costs and benefits of potential mitigation options and support making decisions on how to best prioritize solutions with limited resources. Obviously, if we had an infinite amount of money, we'd be able to make all of our roadways and transportation assets more resilient, but unfortunately that's not the case, so we have to prioritize. And the methodology that this is a very sky level overview of the phase one approach. We took all of the region's roadways and then overlaid it on in a risk and exposure analysis by looking at things like wildfire, storm surge, nuisance flooding, and then on top of that, we looked at criticality analysis, which I'll explain a little bit more the next couple of slides, where we look at traffic volumes, evacuation route designations, what these roads connect to, and whether they're vital services or how many people they serve, as well as looking at freight movement. Because as we saw with last year with Hurricane Milton and Helene, freight movement's very important. We want to get all of our grocery stores stocked, our gas stations refilled, and all of that sort of thing. And then on top of that, we looked at a probability analysis, which is, how likely are certain weather events going to happen? And then as a result of that, we assigned all of the region's roadways tiers either 1, 2, or 3, depending on their level of exposure and criticality. So for some quick definitions here, before getting too in depth, it's important to understand these terms because they might on their surface seem interchangeable, but they're quite different actually. On the left here, we have resilience, which is about how well our transportation system can handle these shocks like hurricanes or long-term stresses like sea level rise and still serve their purpose and function. In the middle there is vulnerability, which is where we focused a lot of our analysis, and it essentially comes down to 3 basic questions. How negative of an impact would it be to the region if this transportation asset failed? If you're looking at a local road, it might be, some people in a neighborhood might have to take a detour, or would they be trapped? That's something we looked at. And we also looked at whether it's a designated evacuation route where obviously those are important with hurricanes. You don't want those being congested or failing, and then you result with more people being stuck in the region, and that's quite important. Adaptive capacity is how well it could hold up when something happens based on its age and condition. So when we're doing our analysis, is it a newer bridge that is probably built up to higher standards nowadays, or is it a bridge that's already kind of on its last legs and more cause for concern? Lastly, exposure. as a subset of vulnerability is how likely is the transportation asset to be impacted in a given year. This brings us to the third consideration, risk, which combines how likely an event is and how serious the impacts would be if it happens. A flooded road matters a lot more if it cuts off emergency access, freight movement, or serves a lot of people. So instead of just asking where does flooding or wildfires happen, we're asking where does it happen and where would it cause the most harm if those assets failed. So that's the basic lens we looked through for both phases of this study. So as Nina also covered, there's certainly been a lot of existing work on resiliency, which comes from our local partners, the state. So we kind of inventoried all the work that had been already done, and that gave us a clear baseline moving into the risk analysis. And as the other part of this was identifying where are these critical areas, like employment and activity centers, government and critical facilities, as well as, like Seaport, Manatee, and freight distribution areas. Oh, there's that. And here's just a sample of maps for more visual learners out there, myself included. Here's the region's roadways that we were working with at the onset. And then here we can see pulling from a number of different data sources, where in the region is at most risk of wildfires and where storm surge is more of a concern. So obviously if you were to ask someone where is the most, where in the region is most exposed to natural disasters, people would rightly assume, the coastal areas and areas near water, and they would be correct for storm surge and flooding, but wildfires are also a big issue that we have to take into account as well. And then on top of that, we were also looking at designated evacuation routes, which were certainly given priority because sometimes it's best to just get out. And then on top of that, we were looking at traffic volumes, not shown here, but we also looked at freight traffic volumes to see where freight's moving as well as where people are moving. So really it's a lot of different factors that we kind of had to figure out a way to take together and weigh them. So like in this example, if a road was an evacuation route and carried a lot of daily traffic, that would probably get priority over a road that might just carry a lot of traffic but isn't an evacuation route, and vice versa. So here's kind of the approach that we did, looking at exposure and criticality. You can see transportation assets that had high exposure and were highly critical to the functioning of the transportation region get tier 1 in red there, and then tier 2 are vulnerable facilities which have moderate exposure, moderate criticality, and then we kind of work our way down to low exposure and low criticality, which those are still things we want to prioritize and protect, but maybe are a little further down the list. So the results are a region-wide perspective on dividing all of our roadways up into tier 1, which are the most vulnerable facilities that typically carry the most traffic and maybe an evacuation route or connect to a medical facility. And you can see that this tier also includes bridges that serve as vital connections. There's no detour if it fails, really. So those are tier 1 and where we want to prioritize investments. Tier 2 is blue on the map, and these facilities may carry less traffic, maybe a transit route or connect to schools and employment centers where people might want to hunker down for a storm event. And then tier 3, which is visualized in gray, are typically more local roads and carry the least amount of traffic and do not connect to vital services. So with those, we get, once the assets were prioritized, mitigation strategies were identified at a higher level. These strategies were grouped into 4 types, basically protecting or strengthening components of an asset, or using natural functions and features like bioswales, or using policy solutions to influence how communities are developed, and educating people to improve resilience at a household or neighborhood level. We can directly influence exposure and adaptive capacity with these mitigation strategies, whereas criticality may be indirectly influenced as well, but risk factors are constant. So just to name a few of the roads that we found to be the highest priority locations, none of these are too surprising. We have the interstates, the regional, the highly important regional roads like US 301, SR 70, River Road, and the Venice Bypass. So moving on from that, phase one leads directly into phase two, whereas phase one, it was more identifying where the issues may lie. Phase two, we really wanted to drill down and get some project recommendations and studies out, because as much as we love planning, we love even more to do planning that has a path forward and leads to real improvements for the region. So we identified priorities from that were labeled as tier one in the first analysis, and then kind of worked with the public in public facing surveys, as well as working with our local partners from the cities, counties, FDOT, and then used plans and analysis to identify funding and kind of filter it down so we have fewer highest priority projects that have local backing, local interest, and have a path forward. So here's the kind of high level overview of phase two, where we take the tier one roadways from resiliency phase one, refined the list down with local feedback, and underwent a far more detailed analysis of each segment, which these segments were then incorporated into the 2050 Long Range Transportation Plan, and thus are now eligible for funding. So as I kind of alluded to, the stakeholder engagement was a several-pronged approach. We did a virtual survey to get public feedback among everyone, and then we had stakeholder interviews, which is local officials, elected officials, decision makers, and really trying to get everyone's affected by this. We were trying to get emergency management staff, as well as local transportation planners from our various cities, and just essentially getting the word out. We even created our own advisory group where we had specific meetings that people would come to and kind of work through the recommendations and see not only which projects they wanted prioritized, but also kind of tailoring our approach and discussing at length. So the phase two results were we got 18 prioritized roadway segments, as can be seen on the map on the right. And all of these had local support, were subject to in-depth analysis, and resulted in actionable recommendations to improve these roadways because they're regionally significant and would have the biggest, I guess, quote unquote, bang for your buck if for transportation investments. And they were all now in the 2050 Long Range Transportation Plan. And this would probably be best viewed in the report, which I believe if we haven't linked, we will. But each of these segments has a very in-depth analysis, and I just chose these as kind of sampling, so you can see that you see this segment's risk of storm surge, risk of nuisance flooding, its risk of wildfires, as well as its average annual daily traffic, whether it's an evac route, whether it's a transit route, and its status for critical facility connections. And then once that inventory is done, we have more specific recommendations, such as elevating roadways, constructing natural features, pushing forward bridge replacements, as well as some other smaller improvements, or sorry, more easily attainable improvements, like native plantings are huge and are hugely helpful. Undergrounding utilities, and then it also ties directly into the cost feasible plan by listing the projects underneath the project page. So, Nina, do you want to talk about next steps?
Sure. Yeah. So resiliency and vulnerability planning will always be an ongoing effort. I don't think it's something that we'll ever stop doing, and our needs, as we address them, there will always be more and changing needs. So a study that we just scoped and will be kicking off this week, I believe, is a watershed and transportation asset analysis. And so this is building on the existing resiliency work that we have done so far. Really, the impetus for this also was that during storms like Helene a few years ago, and some of the storms previous to that, was we were just surprised by some of the locations of the flooding that we saw. And so, in working with our partners, our local jurisdictional partners, we decided to work on to do the resiliency and vulnerability assessment, but really look at the watershed as well and our floodplains as well, so that we can also prep not only for storm surge or nuisance flooding that we might routinely see along the coast or along our waterways, but try and identify the other sources of flooding and where we might see them. And then we'll be updating our project prioritization as well, to further build resiliency into how we prioritize projects. Out of the watershed and transportation asset analysis, we are looking at potentially, and I'm saying this because it would really be it's currently a wish list item. Something that would be really great for us to do is to start looking at modeling 25 years out against our hazards and things like flooding and future land use and development. And so given the hazards that we do have, given where we know where our transportation assets are affected, and having a better understanding of where development may happen in the future, where can we expect to see things like flooding, and how can we best prepare those transportation assets by beginning to plan for it now, so that it's a little bit less retroactive and a little bit more forward planning. Again, this is something that we are just starting to think about, but I think relative to their long-range transportation plan and having a good understanding of where development will be happening, this is sort of something that it's a goal. It's a something that we're working towards. And then out of the watershed and transportation asset analysis also is looking at doing an evacuation study, just making sure that our routes are where they need to be. How can we better work with our partners and our transit partners to get people out of dangerous areas and back home afterwards, so that we're best prepared for storms and other hazards. So this is kind of where we are right now. So maybe in a couple of years we can present on the watershed and transportation asset analysis. Thanks, Nick. You can go to the next slide.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, yeah, and these are, I can send these in the chat. I think they were sent early on, but you could read the studies, and then we also have an interactive map for viewing tiers 1 through 3 from resiliency phase 1, as well as seeing the prioritized project segments from tier 2. And that's certainly something we could, if anyone has specific questions, we can pull up and go through it as well. But it's more of a resource for everybody. I'll send the links in the chat or as a follow-up email. And yeah, thank you for having us. Now we're available to answer any questions you all may have.
Okay, thank you, Nina and Nick. Very much appreciate it. That was terrific. And a couple questions came in. Before I put them out there, I will say as Nick gets the links posted in the chat, I guess. It's really fascinating to go through the whole report. The amount of detail in there is really impressive, and it gives you a lot more information than they could offer in a fairly short period of presentation here. So a couple questions, and this might be better directed to legislators, but the funds returned to the feds. Nina or Nick, is there anything you can offer as to why that happened? Why the state returned the funds to the feds? I know you referred to that during your comments.
Sure. And I can provide some follow-up with some of the language that was published by the state. But yeah, some of it had to do with concerns that the funding was tied to ideologically driven goals rather than non-ideologically driven goals. And part of it, I think was the language, was the idea, because the carbon reduction fund specifically is focused on projects that would reduce the amount of carbon emissions. And so it would fund any kind of project from trails to sidewalks and bike lanes, transit, but also other operational improvements. And so I think there was some concern about the relationship between carbon and yeah, not sure how to frame that out. Right.
Well,
Wait.
I think we get your
Yeah.
drift.
Yes, okay.
Okay, thank you.
Politics.
Good night. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying politics. Long story short.
Yep. Okay. All right. Your collaboration with the various other local agencies. I know you referred to it a number of times during your presentation. Um, what do you do to sort of continue to track those? Once you issue your report, what do you do to track how the jurisdictions are implementing those or not implementing those, and going forward, just putting your recommendations into place?
Mhm. Well, they're since they're identified in our cost feasible section of our long range transportation plan, we have, I don't know what the right word is here, Dina, not money set aside, but we've identified it as a priority and something we'd like to support, but ultimately it's up to them to apply for. So we are kind of constantly in talks with them, and we're aware of what they're applying for, and we certainly encourage our local partners to apply. And basically, the way the MPO is set up is we see them all the time. We actually just got done with a technical advisory committee meeting, which is made up of representatives from all the local jurisdictions. So we're always constantly in communication and working on moving these projects forward. I don't know if Nina had anything else to add to that, but that would be my answer.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And as we develop our next long-range transportation plan, what is really great to see is that we bring the list back to our partners and they'll say, okay, you can cross that one off. We no longer need this. We've got local funds behind this project. And even in developing the current long-range plan, we had, I mean, when you look at the map, the list of projects on tier 1, 2, and 3, tier 1 alone is, I mean, 50 plus projects, right? And then our shortened list, I think, was, I wasn't, what did we say, 9, 20? Regardless, far too
That was
many.
yeah, 18.
Yeah,
Close.
and so 18. And so in developing the long range plan, we went to our jurisdictional partners to say, okay, these are projects that really came out on top when we did this assessment. And which are the projects that you will be looking at the MPO to for funding opportunities? And so what we were able to do is have those conversations and then hear from the counties to say, we already have a plan in place for this roadway. We don't need to look at the MPO for funding, or we're pursuing another funding source, or we've already done that project. Um, and then, yes, over the next 5 years, we continue tracking the projects that are eligible. So yeah.
Now, I know Manatee County is one example. Just in this October, a couple of months ago, issued or released, I guess, their vulnerability assessment. If something comes along, subsequent to when you had yours, do you incorporate their results into your ongoing work?
Yes. So even in scoping the watershed study, we talked to both counties. We talked to the regional, the Tampa Bay Planning Council, for example. And one conversation was in starting out, we need to get a good idea of who has done what, so that we can use that as a starting point. And what we will see is that there is a great deal of overlap between what the counties have found in their assessments and what we have found in our assessments. Now we just need to make them talk to each other. So that coordination moving forward is going to be key so that we're not all replicating the same exact work, and that we can really capitalize on the work that we're doing. And that the MPO then can understand how can we be the best partner in helping the locals do the work that they're already doing.
All right, thank you. And a question just came in. is the MPO, or what is the MPO's responsibility for obtaining funding for the next phases of the Bradenton to Palmetto Connector Bridge project?
Good question.
Okay.
Bradenton Palmetto seems to make it into every meeting. But certainly one of the biggest regional projects that we have going on, and much needed. So the Bradenton Palmetto Connector is an MPO priority. It is a project that we are interested in seeing moving forward. The MPO has funded the next phase of the study, but we will be looking at the state to line up funding for the construction. So the MPO historically does not fund bridge projects because there is a dedicated state and federal program for bridges. But we have done a great deal of coordination work, not only in the last few years, but in the last 10 to 20 years on getting this project going. And we were able to put some funds. If it wasn't the PD&E, let me check real quick and see which fund, but we did put some funds towards the project to keep it moving forward.
Okay, thank you. That is all the questions that were submitted. So with that, Nina, feel free to chime back in once you get the information you're looking for. With that, Ruth, I guess I'll turn it back over to you.
I see that there's one more
Mhm.
question
Oh.
that just popped in
Just
about
popped in. Go ahead. Yeah.
Mhm.
taking into consideration approved housing. That's I guess covered by we do population projections and traffic projections regularly and regularly update it in our long range transportation plan. So like this latest modeling update where we projected where most of the growth is going to occur. That also comes from talking with our local partners, and all of them have a future land use plan where it's what they're planning, what kind of developments they're planning to approve in different areas of the county. So we kind of match that. So as long as they're sticking to the plan, it should be it should be represented in a lot of our projections, and thus kind of feeding into the resiliency study as well as everything else that we do.
Okay, and just as you were responding, another set of questions, if you will, came in. And can you see those, Nina and Nick? So if you want to quickly address those, we're getting a little short on time, but we do have a few minutes if you want to comment on the questions that came in. The first of those is an example of a model project in this area that improves road resiliency. Is there an example you can offer of a recent road project that was not well done in terms of resiliency? And how could rail or other transit projects in this area benefit from resiliency funding?
Great questions. Let me start. So I'm going to start with number 3 because I have a good example of what happened after one of the most recent storms. Well, first of all, transit is absolutely essential for evacuations, right? Our transit providers free up buses to move residents into and out of the area or move them towards shelters. So being able to support our transit projects, our transit partners in accomplishing that, and then making sure that those routes are open is key, right? And that's just a security matter. And then also rail, but then I'm going to couple into that freight. After one of the most recent storms, what we saw was that the major corridors leading to Seaport Manatee, which was a major gas supplier, was flooded. And so if we can improve resiliency around the port, it means that the region can bounce back easier if we're able to move things like gas into the area. And so that's an example of how that could work. An example of a model project. I don't want to have one off the top of my head, but I do know that City of Sarasota is working on looking at doing some improvements at the City of Sarasota in St. Armand's. which also dealt with a great deal of flooding after the most recent storms. And they have applied for funding through the MPO to address a resiliency component in St. Armand's. And it's dealing specifically with stormwater and then also pumping water out of the area so that residents can get back to their homes faster and emergency response can access the area. I don't have an example of a not well done project off the top of my head. So I'll have to get back to you on that one.
Okay, fair
Yeah,
enough.
I was just gonna say with so phase two with the 18 prioritized segments, it doesn't negate phase one, which split the entire region into, tiers 1 through 3. So a result of that is those segments are still used for scoring. So even if it's not one of the 18 high priority projects, if someone's I don't know, proposing a road widening or some other improvement, and they want to get bonus points in our prioritization tool, they're definitely, um, you know, they're better off including some of those resiliency improvements because then they would score higher on the in the prioritization tool by making those small improvements. So even if something's not specifically a resiliency project, the way we have project prioritization and selection set up, it's certainly we're doing our part in encouraging resiliency in every project. So that was just one thing I wanted to add to Nina's already really good answer.
Okay, thank you.
And
Okay.
If I could just follow up on the
Yep.
Bradenton Palmetto question.
okay,
So I can provide the link in the chat, and this is how you access what the state's transportation improvement program is. And I'll share my screen just momentarily. This is what this STIP looks like for Sarasota Manatee. Or let me share that. The Bradenton Palmetto connector, you can always find it by this number. And so it looks like the most recent phase is the PD&E phase, and it was funded by a combination of state funds and MPO funds. So these SU, STP greater than 200,000, those are the MPO's funds. And so this is one way that we try and work with our partners to make sure that these big projects do keep moving. Because if these funds aren't lined up for the next phase, it's very easy for them to stop with the momentum. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well.
Good.
thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ruth.
I'm going to go ahead and close things out first by thanking our speakers very much. Thank you, Nina and Nick. We very much appreciated the information you provided, the links that you have provided so that we can follow up on those things. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for storm surge, flooding, and wildfires. Are we ready? You can see that there is thought going into being prepared. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Manatee County, we're grateful for your time, your attention, and your commitment to civic engagement. As a reminder, today's program has been recorded and will be available on the LWV Manatee YouTube channel within the next day. You will shortly receive an email with a link to the slide presentation that our speakers used. We invite you to stay connected with the League, get involved in upcoming events and initiatives. Our website, lwvmanatee.org, has the calendar of events and action team meetings.